Welcome back to Klepper's Corner. Today in history. April 8th is one of those dates where humanity somehow manages to be spiritual, imperial, artistic, constitutional, technological, and deeply weird all before lunch. It is a day when religions bloom, kingdoms get cursed, empires plant flags, lawmakers invent procedure, and entire civilizations prove that history is often just people making giant decisions while pretending they absolutely know what they're doing. So tonight, let's walk through an April 8th archive full of beauty, power plays, stubbornness, and the occasional vanishing national monument. Segment 1, and Flowers, Faith, and Fortresses of Power. April 8th opens in a strangely perfect historical pairing. One tradition celebrates enlightenment with sweet tea and spring blossoms, while another reminds us that medieval politics was basically a blood feud with paperwork. The birth of Siddhartha Gautama, later commemorated through Hana Matsuri, became this beautiful fusion of spiritual symbolism and seasonal renewal, where flowers bloom, tea is poured over the infant Buddha, and believers ritually wash away greed, anger, and ignorance, which is lovely and honestly still more emotionally mature than most cable news panels. At roughly the other end of the human behavioral spectrum, we get Roger II of Sicily being excommunicated in 1139, because nothing says medieval governance like a pope trying to delete a king with church paperwork. Roger, however, responded in the classic strongman style of, "I hear your condemnation, but have you considered that I have an army?" He eventually captured the Pope and forced recognition anyway, which is an incredible twist on the usual apology tour. And then there is the fall of Crac de Chevalier in 1271, where Sultan Baybars used forged correspondence to get an exhausted Crusader garrison to surrender. So on one April 8th, history gives us ritual cleansing, papal fury, and one of the great psychological warfare scams of the medieval world. It is a perfect reminder that civilization has always swung wildly between compassion, conquest, and the eternal human confidence that this obviously fake letter is probably real. Segment 2, and Claiming the World, then Arguing about the Rules. By the early modern period, April 8th becomes a showcase for a recurring human hobby. Arriving somewhere, claiming it, then spending the next few centuries arguing over who gets to make the rules. In 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon stepped ashore and claimed Florida for Spain, attaching imperial paperwork to a land already full of people who had not, notably, requested Spanish branding. The myth remembers him as a dreamy seeker of the fountain of youth, but the actual motives were more familiar: money, labor, status, and the old colonial classic of rebranding greed as exploration. Florida itself got its name from the Easter season, which feels appropriate, because from the beginning it was marketed like a paradise, and then almost immediately turned into a conflict zone. Then, in 1789, the new United States House of Representatives held one of its first real working sessions, and suddenly the revolution had to face its greatest challenge: administrative procedure. This is one of my favorite early American realities. They had defeated an empire, drafted a constitution, and invented a republic, only to get bogged down in the 18th century version of who sends the email and who has to walk it downstairs. The Senate wanted aristocratic dignity. The House laughed at them, and everyone was already arguing over protocol before the government had fully figured out how to govern. It is reassuring in a bleak way that from Spanish colonizers planting flags to American lawmakers debating delivery etiquette, power has always been half grand ambition and half petty institutional drama. History is not just made by visionaries. It is also made by men in formal clothing getting offended about procedure. Segment 3, and Beauty, Steam, and the Machinery of Progress. April 8th also carries that distinctly modern form of confidence, where humanity looks at art, industry, and the Atlantic Ocean and says, yes, I think we can master all of this, probably with marble, coal, and a dangerous amount of self-belief. In 1820, the Vetus de Milo was discovered on Melos, and within days it became part archaeological treasure, part geopolitical asset, part museum rebranding campaign. France had lost major masterpieces after Napoleon, and suddenly this broken statue arrived like a public relations miracle in marble form. Even better, when the inscription inconveniently suggested a later Hellenistic origin instead of the more fashionable classical one, it somehow vanished. Amazing. We like to think propaganda got invented by television consultants, but art historians were apparently already doing focus-grouped mythology with chisels. Then, in 1838, Brunel's SS Great Western launched on its maiden voyage and helped prove that steam power could cross the Atlantic reliably. This was a revolution in movement, commerce, and migration, though it also began with a boiler room fire and a passenger list so tiny it sounds less like a triumph of industry and more like 7 people accidentally boarding the future. And naturally, it turned into a race with the Sirius, whose crew started burning furniture to stay in motion. That may be the most Victorian sentence ever constructed. So here we have the 19th century in miniature. One civilization worshiping ideal beauty, while another straps paddle wheels to oak, points at the ocean, and says, "Burn the chairs if necessary." Elegant, irrational, magnificent progress. Segment 4, and freedom declared, denied, and dragged forward. One of the clearest April 8th themes is that democracy rarely arrives cleanly. It comes through obstruction, contradiction, and people being forced to drag institutions toward their own stated ideals. In 1864, the U.S. Senate passed the 13th Amendment, taking the first major legislative step toward permanently abolishing slavery. Even in the middle of the Civil War, the country still had to formally state that human beings could not be owned, which is the kind of moral lag that should make every patriotic speech carry at least a little embarrassment. But it mattered, because Lincoln's wartime emancipation was not enough. The Constitution itself had to be changed, which meant power had to admit, finally and in writing, that the entire system had been built around a monstrous lie. Then, in 1913, the 17th Amendment was ratified, shifting the election of senators from state legislatures to voters. It sounds procedural, but it was a massive transfer of power away from smoke-filled rooms and toward the public, which is why it was resisted for so long. And then, in 1960, the Senate broke a civil rights filibuster for the first time, finally forcing action on voting rights after Southern obstruction had turned racism into legislative endurance theater. The image that stays with you is Senator Claire Engel, unable to speak after brain surgery, pointing to his eye to cast an aye vote. That is democracy at its best and saddest. Institutions so broken that justice requires a man to physically fight his own body just to help government behave like government. April 8th keeps showing us that freedom is not self-executing. It has to be pushed through rooms specifically designed to stop it. Segment 5, and empire, war, and the limits of official power. If previous April 8th stories were about building institutions, this stretch is about what happens when institutions become instruments of domination, panic, or global rearrangement. The Entente Cordiale was signed in 1904, ending Britain's so-called splendid isolation and bringing London and Paris into strategic alignment. On paper, it was about smoothing colonial disputes. In practice, it was Europe's ruling class calmly dividing territories on maps while the continent drifted toward the catastrophe of World War I. Nothing says peace like two empires agreeing which distant places they are allowed to control more politely. During World War II, April 8, 1942, marked desperate efforts to maintain rail access and supply lifelines to besiege Leningrad, where millions were trapped in one of the most horrific sieges in human history. That story strips away all heroic varnish and leaves raw survival. Starvation, freezing, ration cards, state terror, and yet still a society refusing to collapse. It is one of those moments where history stops being abstract and becomes almost unbearable in human scale. Then, in 1952, President Truman seized the steel mills during the Korean War, convinced that production could not stop. It triggered a constitutional crisis, and the Supreme Court reminding the White House that emergency power is not magic, which is a very American story. Even when a president says, "This is urgent," the Constitution still replies, "That is adorable. Show me the statute." Put together, these events reveal the tension at the center of modern power. Governments promise order, survival, and security. But on April 8th, history repeatedly asks the same question. Who gets to decide? And what happens when they decide too much? Segment 6, and records, reputations, and the strange theater of modern memory. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, April 8th becomes a stage where history is filtered through television, celebrity, public grief, and the giant machinery of national image-making. In 1953, Jomo Kenyatta was sentenced by British colonial authorities in Kenya in what was supposed to crush a movement and instead help turn him into a martyr who would later lead an independent nation. Empire once again demonstrated its unique talent for manufacturing its own replacement. In 1959, COBOL was formally created, thanks in enormous part to Grace Hopper's insistence that programming should use readable language instead of being an exclusive priesthood of symbols. That may be the most radical April 8th move of all, making technology legible to ordinary institutions. In 1974, Hank Aaron hit home run number 715 under a cloud of racist threats, and the moment became larger than baseball. It was not just a record broken. It was the country being forced to watch dignity outperform hatred on live television. Then, David Copperfield made the Statue of Liberty vanish in 1983, which is a sentence so deeply American it sounds fake even when true. In 1990, Ryan White died after changing how the nation understood AIDS, proving that one teenager with grace and courage could show more moral clarity than entire systems of adults. The funeral of Pope John Paul II in 2005 turned the papacy into a global diplomatic tableau. And Axiom Mission 1 in 2022 signaled that even space had entered the age of privatization. So April 8th ends where modern history often does, with spectacle, symbolism, pain, endurance, and a camera somewhere nearby making sure the rest of us learn the lesson, or at least catch the replay. In conclusion, April 8th is a date that keeps exposing the strange overlap between ideals and performance. It gives us rituals of compassion, forged surrender letters, colonial land grabs, procedural squabbles, constitutional breakthroughs, wartime survival, technological revolutions, athletic courage, public grief, and billionaires in orbit. It reminds us that history is never just a sequence of events. It is a long-running argument over who gets remembered as noble, who gets exposed as ridiculous, and who manages to bend the story anyway. And if this date proves anything, it is that humanity is at its most recognizable when it is reaching for enlightenment with one hand and yanking on power with the other.